I have always been a shadow. I sat quietly at the back of the class, hiding my abilities because I was afraid that if anyone saw them, they would break me. But today, everything changed. Mrs. Jenkins called me to the front of the class and gave me a task that no one else could do. She thought I would give up, but this time I didn't stay in the shadows. It was my time to be seen, and I decided that I would no longer hide. I sat at the back of the classroom, as if the whole class was a distant stage where I wasn't supposed to appear. I had always been a shadow, a girl whom no one noticed or considered important. Teachers gave me minimum grades, and my classmates considered me just another normal girl who was not worth paying attention to. I was the one who kept quiet, sat in the corner, and kept my head down. All I wanted was to get through this time without any fuss, without anyone noticing me. That day was like any other. Math class. Last lesson. It seemed like just one more hour and I'd be home. But everything changed when Mrs. Jenkins, our teacher, gave the class a problem that looked like it came from another planet. My classmates watched silently as the teacher began to explain, ignoring the fact that I was the only one sitting there without any interest. I noticed the looks, the ironic smiles, silent ridicule. Everyone thought I couldn't solve it, that I would sit there and stare blankly at the problem because it wasn't for me. I wasn't part of this game. I never had been. But this time, it had to be different. Mrs. Jenkins noticed that I wasn't distracted. Her eyes darted to me as if she knew she didn't like me, that I was just another problem student. She knew I wasn't a straight-A student, but she didn't know why. "Rachel, can you solve this?" Her voice was calm, but I could sense the tension. It wasn't just a question, it was a challenge. She had probably decided that now was the time to put me in my place. The class fell silent, and all eyes turned back to me. I had no desire or willingness to answer, but I stood up anyway. Most people don't know what it's like to sit in the shadows, unheard and unseen. But those moments, when all eyes are on you, become the most unbearable. "Rachel," she repeated, already impatient. Everyone was waiting for me to fail. It was another trap, and for the first time, I felt that I wasn't ready to leave it unanswered. Not out of pride, but because I couldn't be the person everyone was used to seeing anymore. I looked at the board. The problem was difficult, but I immediately saw its structure. It was a simple sequence of numbers that could be solved using a single strategy. Mrs. Jenkins and the class thought I would be confused. They thought I couldn't do it, and that this moment would make them happy because I would still be the one who couldn't. I looked at my pen, and a plan formed in my mind. I walked up to the board, and my movements were quick, even decisive. I wrote the equation as if it were a simple and familiar thing. Every step, every mark, it was so natural that I didn't even think about it. I knew that maybe not everyone in the class would understand how I was doing it, but it didn't matter. They wouldn't understand because they had never paid any attention to me. I was nothing more than a shadow to them, just a figure sitting at my desk waiting for the day to end. Mrs. Jenkins stood in front of me, and her gaze seemed to grow angrier. She had decided that I still couldn't solve the problem. She was sure of it because she had always thought of me as average. But this time was different. My hand didn't shake as I wrote the answer. I knew I wouldn't stop, even if everyone was watching. I was going to do it. I wrote down the final answer and returned to the classroom. Everyone looked at me expectantly. Mrs. Jenkins was confused, but she couldn't admit it. She opened her calculator to check my answer, and her face showed complete surprise. It was the correct answer. The whole class fell silent. Everyone was impressed. Mrs. Jenkins looked at me, her hands holding her phone, but her gaze was not the same as before. She couldn't believe it. It was more than just math. I had just shattered the image she had of me. I had dispelled the image of the lazy girl and demonstrated that I was capable of more than anyone had thought. And, surprisingly, I didn't feel afraid. Everyone began to whisper quietly among themselves, and I knew that nothing could change this now. I was no longer average. I was someone more. I returned to my seat, but every step felt heavy. All eyes were on me, and even the silence felt like a heavy curtain enveloping me on all sides. Mrs. Jenkins was so surprised that her usual contempt was gone from her face. She just stood there silently, staring at me as if trying to understand what had happened. I sat down, feeling my fingers tremble, not from fear, but from excitement. I didn't understand why I felt this way. All these years I had sat in the shadows where no one could see me, and now suddenly I was the center of attention. It wasn't what I wanted, but now there was no turning back. The classroom fell silent for a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. Then the first whispers began. Some whispered, some laughed, some couldn't believe what had happened. I could hear the boys in the front rows trying to come up with jokes, trying to belittle what I had done because it just didn't fit into their worldview. "You're lazy," I heard Lana's voice say. She sat at the front desk, always well-dressed, always active, always the center of attention. Lana often laughed at me because of my silence, because I was not like normal people. Now her words sounded less convincing, and her expression was almost shocked. It was no longer the usual contempt. It was something more. I turned back to myself, trying not to pay attention to their whispering. I wasn't scared, but I felt uncomfortable. I wasn't used to being noticed, used to being the center of attention. All this time, I had tried not to attract attention, and now I saw how easy it was to break that rule. I was no longer a shadow. I had become someone who couldn't be ignored. At that moment, I realized one thing. All these years, I had been afraid to show my true strength, my abilities. I thought that if I showed what I was capable of, it would scare everyone around me. My parents always told me that it wasn't for me, that I shouldn't stand out. My mother constantly repeated that it was more important to be modest than to stand out from the crowd. But was that really true? Was I giving up my power because of other people's fears and limitations? Mrs. Jenkins suddenly turned her attention to the class. She was clearly upset, but instead of turning the situation to her advantage, she simply said, "That's impossible." Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide open, like someone who had seen something that completely shattered their perception of reality. I sat there feeling a strange sense of pride. And even though I knew that no one in the class would believe in my victory, I knew that I had changed something important. It wasn't just a math problem. It was my moment when I decided for the first time to stop hiding. But from that moment on, I couldn't remain unchanged. It wasn't just a problem I had solved. It was my battle with the fear that had haunted me all these years. Every glance from the teacher, every whisper, every look, none of it was just a part of my reality anymore. I couldn't just stand by and remain silent, especially since even now I could feel their eyes on me. Only now those looks were different. They were no longer mocking, they were curious, frightened, surprised. I think I could see some of them trying to find the strength to cope with what I had just done. At the end of the lesson, when the bell finally rang, I got up and headed for the door, feeling a strange sense of anxiety and relief at the same time. My steps were confident, but I had many questions in my mind. What would happen next? What would they think of me now? Would they understand that I wasn't what I seemed to be? Would they try to humiliate me again for what I had done? I was already standing at the exit when I heard a voice. It was Kevin, the boy who had been sitting next to me. He was, of course, the one who knows nothing, the one who always laughs at everyone and doesn't take anything seriously. He approached me, looking at me with distrust. You really decided to do this?" His voice was surprised, but not hostile. I looked at him, feeling a powerful surge of confidence. I didn't want to be silent anymore. I didn't want to hide. "Yes, I have," I replied, looking him straight in the eye. And I felt those words mark the beginning of a new chapter in my life. Part 3. ChatGPT said, "As soon as I left the classroom, the atmosphere remained behind me, heavy, filled with stares and whispers. I walked down the hallway, and although everything seemed familiar, I felt like I was in a new world. All those looks, all that whispering, they weren't the looks I was used to getting. Now they were different. Not dismissive. Not indifferent. It was what I had been so afraid of: attention. I heard someone following me. A turn, another one, and then Kevin's voice poured into my ear again. "Rachel, are you serious?" His tone was filled with disbelief. It turned out that this small victory had caused more talk than I could have imagined. "Yes, seriously," I replied, not even turning around to see who was behind me. It didn't matter. I had already decided that I wasn't going to hide from their stares and opinions. However, when I was almost at the school exit, I felt my heart start to beat faster. I saw him, Chris. He had always been one of those guys who made fun of me because I didn't stand out in any way. His usual jokes, his casual movements, and even the way he sometimes repeated after me, all of this made me feel like I couldn't be who I wanted to be. But now everything was different. He was here, in front of me. My gaze met his eyes, and they weren't the same as usual. It was no longer a condescending, indifferent look. His eyes now looked at me as if he had just seen me in a different light. It was unusual, but at the same time, pleasant. He took a few steps and stopped in front of me. "Rachel, you're a genius," he said, not trying to hide his admiration. His voice was sincere, and it was something I had never heard from him before. I I didn't know you could do that. I didn't know how to react. How often had I underestimated myself, hiding behind a mask of modesty, believing that my abilities weren't worthy of attention. But here he was, standing in front of me, and I felt something change inside me. I realized that this wasn't just about a math problem. It was about stopping hiding, stopping playing by rules I didn't choose. "Thank you," I replied with a slight smile. It was the first time I didn't feel the need to explain or apologize for being extraordinary. It was my moment, and I had earned it. But before I walked out the school door, my heart skipped a beat. I heard footsteps approaching. I was on edge when I heard a familiar voice. It was Mrs. Jenkins. She was walking quickly, but her footsteps sounded different than usual. They were heavy, a little hurried, but not angry. She stopped in front of me, and her gaze was not one of contempt, but of doubt. I wondered if she would be angry, if she would try to keep me there again, to convince me that I didn't deserve such attention. But her words were different. "Rachel," she said, her voice soft but firm. I owe you." She paused as if searching for the right words. "You showed me that I was wrong. You are a true talent, and I was blind to it." Her words were unexpected, and I felt myself relax inside. I hadn't expected this. She continued, "I should have recognized your abilities much earlier. You shouldn't have had to hide." I looked at her face, at the expression that left no room for doubt. It wasn't just an apology. It was an admission that she hadn't understood me. Mrs. Jenkins had also had a moment of realization, a moment when she understood that I wasn't what she thought I was. I walked out of that hallway knowing that something had changed. It wasn't just a step into a new life. It was more than that. It was a recognition of my strength, of my abilities. Now I wasn't a shadow. Now I was Rachel, the one who did the impossible. A few more steps and I was out of school. The street in front of me didn't look the same as it always had. It seemed like every moment now mattered, and I was ready to take on the world. As I walked across the schoolyard, I felt a light breeze ruffle my hair, but it didn't calm me. All those stares, all that whispering, I knew it would be there. If I had been a few months ago, I would have hurried home, trying to avoid them. But now it was different. I couldn't hide anymore, and there was no room for fear inside me. All I wanted was to feel free. And freedom was close, even if it meant accepting those stares. "Did you see that? It's Rachel. She solved that problem. That's impossible." I heard my classmates' voices coming at me from all sides. And although their goal wasn't entirely clear, I no longer felt anger or embarrassment. I was just here. I was, and that was enough. It seemed like every step I took, every word I heard, was something new. Many of these people had never paid any attention to me before. I was just part of the scenery to them, uninteresting. But now that I had proven myself, they all started looking at me differently. I was no longer the quiet Rachel from the back of the class. I was different. Among those whispering, I saw Lana. She was walking toward me, and although her face was almost invisible, I could see a change in her gaze. She wasn't as confident as usual. Lana approached and stopped next to me. Her expression changed. Now she wasn't looking at me with mockery, but with something more like respect. "I didn't think you could do that," she said, her words cautious. It wasn't what I expected from her. Lana had never been one to acknowledge someone else's strength, especially when that strength could make her feel less important. There was a certain weight to her voice, as if she had just realized that everything she had thought about me was completely unfounded. "I didn't ask you to think about me," I replied calmly. It was a genuine, honest acknowledgement of my new position. I was no longer willing to hide or conform to other people's perceptions of me. I was myself, and that mattered. As I walked across the courtyard, I saw familiar faces that had been filled with indifference just a few days ago, but now they looked at me differently. They couldn't understand why I, a girl whom no one had noticed, had suddenly decided to break out of the shadows. And that made me happy. When I got on the bus, I noticed that the boys in the back seats were whispering to each other. It wasn't the same as before. Now they were talking with respect, not irony. And although I wasn't ready for all the consequences, I didn't want to go back. When I got home, the feeling that something had changed stayed with me. And although my mother was already waiting at home, Her greeting was calm but strange. She looked at me not with the usual concern that was always in her eyes, but with a new look that was difficult to define. Was she surprised? No, but something in her eyes told me that she understood everything. My mother had always been a person who valued modesty, but now she saw that I was capable of more than she had ever imagined. "How was school?" she asked, with a slight hint of interest, without imposing her questions. I felt that her question was not just a formality. It was something more than simple interest. "Fine," I replied, sitting on the couch, sensing her expectation. But I knew that fine was only part of the truth. It was much more complicated than that. It was more than just solving a problem. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind was racing. I still couldn't believe that this change had happened. All these years, I had kept myself locked away, afraid of what others would say. Now everything was different. I was ready to be myself. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was only the beginning. Now I understood that the real struggle was still ahead of me. Now that I had shown my strength, I had to keep it, not let it fade away. But it would be even harder to go through this knowing that everything could change in an instant. And I was ready for it. The next day, I woke up feeling like it wasn't just another day. It was a new beginning, something I couldn't deny, even if I wanted to. Everything around me was the same, but at the same time different. I was different. I couldn't go back to being the old Rachel, the girl no one noticed or paid attention to. Now that I had demonstrated my power, I felt that every step I took in this world now mattered. When I arrived at school, it no longer felt like my usual entrance. I felt eyes on me, but now they weren't mocking or ironic. They were curious. Many whispered among themselves, recalling that moment in class when I solved a problem that even the best students couldn't solve. And although many still couldn't accept what I had done, I didn't care anymore. They would understand in time. Mrs. Jenkins no longer looked at me as if I were unworthy of attention. Now she addressed me with respect, even when we passed each other in the hallway. I saw a different attitude in her eyes. There was no more humiliation or underestimation. She recognized my strength, my abilities, and even though it was difficult for her, she no longer tried to suppress me. But the biggest moment came when I met Chris. He was no longer the guy who used to make fun of me, and now he looked at me as if he had seen a person who could change everything around him for the first time. His gaze was not mocking, it was admiring and sincere. You did it," he said, approaching me in a new way. It wasn't just a statement of fact, it was an acknowledgement that I was truly capable of more than they had ever imagined. I stopped, took a deep breath, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to hide. There was no need to apologize for my strength. I looked at him and said, "Yes, I did it, and I won't hide anymore." And there I stood in front of the school, ready to face whatever awaited me. There was no more room for fear or doubt. I felt this moment becoming an important turning point in my life. My classmates, my teachers, all these people who once thought I was less than them now saw me in a completely different light. And I realized that this wasn't just a moment for them, it was a moment for me. I didn't just show that I could do more. I showed that I would no longer sit in the shadows. And suddenly I realized this was my moment of liberation, but more importantly, I was ready for the future. Ready to truly be myself, despite everything around me. I will no longer allow other people's views and limitations to define who I should be. Now I decide who I will be. As soon as I walked out of the school gates, I felt confident, as if the whole world system had just shifted and I was no longer just part of its background. I was in the foreground, and that foreground belonged to me. Yes, I had to go through difficulties and new challenges, but now I was ready to face them. I wasn't hiding. I was Rachel, and no one could stop me anymore.